Picture this: a wind howls across the jagged cliffs of the North Sea. Mist coils like ghostly serpents around your ankles as the cold of eternity crawls up your spine. It's the year 793 AD, but time means nothing here. Not when you're staring out at the black water and watching shadows rise. Long ships, sleek and serpent-like, cutting through the waves like blades across flesh. Their dragon heads glint with sunless light, snarling toward the coast. They come not to trade, not to speak, not to leave. They come to devour. These are not the romantic Vikings your history books gently described, the rugged warriors, the daring explorers. No, these are executioners of the soul. They don't come with swords alone. They come with something darker, something colder. They come with weaponized intimacy, with hands trained not just to kill, but to dominate the very fabric of human dignity. To the Vikings, sex was never private, never sacred. It was war. It was structure. It was law. Your position during intimacy could elevate you or erase you. One whispered insult about your bedroom role could justify your murder, not just socially, but legally. They created a civilization where masculinity was a currency and submission was death, where rape wasn't just an act of cruelty. It was a political tool, a religious act, a sentence of exile not only for the body, but for the spirit. Forget what you think you know about them. The Vikings weren't just warriors. They were architects of psychological terror, sculptors of shame, high priests of domination who sanctified suffering in the name of power. And now, we dig beneath the surface, to the bone, to the blood, to the unbearable truths buried in the soil of Scandinavia. Because beneath the myths of mead halls and long beards lies something far more disturbing. A system where sexuality was not freedom, but a method of conquest, ruthless, precise, and devastatingly effective. Welcome to the side of Viking history they never taught you, the one that doesn't end in Valhalla, but begins in hell. Part 1, Sex, Power. They called it honor. But the word was a lie. Beneath the carved timber of longhouses, beneath the painted shields and toasts to Valhalla, honor in Viking society was not forged from courage nor tempered by justice. It was carved from dominance, sexual dominance. In the frozen reaches of the Norse world, masculinity wasn't something you felt. It wasn't a virtue. It wasn't even a matter of birth. It was a code, unwritten in scrolls, but etched in blood, flesh, and ritual. You weren't a man because you hunted or ruled or prayed. You were a man because of how you conquered in war, in words, and most of all, in bed. Your sexual position was not a secret. It was a declaration. To penetrate was to possess. To be penetrated was to perish, not always in body, but in honor, in name, in right. That moment between bodies could erase your right to speak in court, to inherit your father's land, to wield a sword, or even to be remembered. And so, Viking men lived in a silent war, not against enemies, but against perception. Every gesture was a performance, every silence a threat, every night a test. To be called arger or urgi, words laced with the venom of sexual shame, was not just humiliating. It was an incantation of erasure, a label that cursed a man into non-existence. Because in this society, being the passive partner wasn't a private matter of preference. It was an attack on your existence, one that the law empowered you to answer with bloodshed. If someone accused you of being unmanly, You had the legal right to kill them on the spot and walk away without consequence, not because the gods willed it, but because the entire framework of power depended on it. This was not casual cruelty. It was systemic, sacred, surgical. To be penetrated was to fall beneath the rights of even a slave. Slaves had names. Slaves had purpose. But you, marked by shame, became something less. A void in the tapestry of society, a stain no bloodline could wash clean. And so, Viking masculinity became a theater of perpetual assertion. No room for gentleness, no room for hesitation. You had to dominate or die trying. A moment of softness could undo generations of legacy. This wasn't about desire. It wasn't about orientation. It was about control, about who held power and who held still. In Viking society, sex was a blade, honed not for pleasure, but for judgment. A blade that could cut you a throne or slit your throat in silence. And yet, this war of flesh and pride did not stay within the walls of their homes. It sailed with them across dark seas and smoking coastlines. They brought with them not just swords and axes, but a belief that to rule one must first dominate the body, yours or another's. And so the body became the battlefield. And the first to fall were their own sons, brothers, and fathers. Part 2, Words That Kill. It didn't take a blade to start a Viking blood feud. Sometimes it didn't even take a shout. All it took was a breath, a pause, a whisper let loose into the cold Nordic air like smoke from a funeral pyre. A man returns from battle, his boots still wet with the blood of strangers, his shoulders heavy with the weight of victory, his name already echoing in the longhouse before he crosses the threshold. He expects glory. He expects silence when he speaks. He expects to be looked at with awe, or at least fear. But then someone leans in, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps a rival, perhaps a jealous friend, and says one word, quietly, almost casually, Arger. The word lands like a dagger between the shoulder blades, not shouted, not written, just spoken. It means everything and nothing, effeminate, weak, worse. It means passive. It means taken. And suddenly, the victory he brought back becomes meaningless. His sword may still be sharp, but his name is now dull, tarnished, spoiled. In that moment, he has only two choices. Strike now, with steel, with fury, with the righteous violence of a man defending his very existence, or hesitate and be consumed. Because if he does nothing, the word becomes truth. Not just gossip, not just insult, it becomes reality, written in the air, carved into memory, and no saga ever forgets. This is how it began, not once, not twice, but over and over and over again. Entire bloodlines obliterated not over land, not over gold, not even over gods, but over rumors, over suggestions, over the unbearable idea that a man might not have been the master in his own bed. The sagas drip with this kind of vengeance. In Njal's saga, a single accusation, no louder than a lover's sigh, sparked a feud that painted the fjords with blood. In Laxdæla saga, a woman stood before her clan, calm as a frozen lake, and said of her husband, he was too gentle. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she named him. And with that name, she shattered everything he had ever built. Because in Viking culture, a woman's voice could strike deeper than any axe. She didn't need to raise her hand, she just needed to speak. And what she spoke became prophecy. Shame in this world wasn't just personal, it was contagious. If a man was marked unmanly, his shame bled upward, staining his father. It bled downward, crippling his sons. It rotted the roots of his bloodline like a silent disease passed through glances and unspoken judgments. One whisper could ruin generations, could erase a legacy more thoroughly than fire. And so, fear became currency. Power wasn't held in crowns or thrones or armies. It was held in the careful management of your reputation. You didn't have to be a king. You just had to make sure no one ever said your name the wrong way. This fear crept into the law, calcified into statute. There were no second chances, no forgiveness. If someone insulted your masculinity, you could kill them, and the law would stand by your side. Not killing them? That was the real crime. It was a world where silence could be fatal, where defending your pride wasn't bravado, it was survival, where men learned early to shout louder, to strike first, to overwhelm suspicion with force before the whisper reached too many ears. Because in Viking society, reputation wasn't earned, it was guarded, it was armed. And once it was gone, no oath, no duel, no blood price could ever bring it back. So every word became a weapon, and every moment of silence was a death sentence in disguise. Part 3, Sex as War. Steel can break bone, a sword can tear muscle, crush skulls, spill blood across the dirt of foreign shores. But shame breaks something far more enduring. It breaks memory, it breaks legacy, it breaks the very idea of who a man is and who he is allowed to be. The Vikings knew this, not by accident, not as a side effect of war, but as a doctrine. They did not simply come for gold or food or land. Those were byproducts, resources to be spent. What they really came for was power that echoed, power that lingered long after the torches burned out. They came to conquer the soul. In their belief system, to wound the body was efficient. But to wound identity, to undo manhood itself, that was victory on a higher plane. They had a word for it, ened, not just insult, not just shame, but symbolic castration, the theft of masculinity, the branding of weakness, the unmaking of worth. And this wasn't done with words alone. It was etched onto flesh. After battle, defeated warriors weren't always killed. Some were held down, stripped, and then cut across the buttocks, not to kill, but to mark. One cut, that was enough. It symbolized penetration. It implied submission. It told the world this man was entered, and that was death. Even if he still breathed, he could go home. He could live for decades, but every time someone looked at him, they'd see it. Not the scar, but what the scar meant. He wasn't a warrior anymore. He was a vessel. He was the physical embodiment of defeat, a walking whisper of someone else's power. And sometimes they went further. The sagas, so often filled with heroic poetry and battles, hold darker verses if you know where to look. Stories of kings stripped naked before their own men, strapped down, and publicly raped, not in secret, not in shame, but in ritual. It was not rage, it was not lust, it was strategy, a surgical removal of power. Because in Viking cosmology, to penetrate was to rise. To be penetrated was to fall forever. It was the spiritual reversal of strength, and they knew, their enemies knew this. They used it. Communities heard of this. They heard the tales, the horror, the humiliation, the irreversible stain. And so, when they saw sails on the horizon, they didn't run for their weapons. They ran for white flags, not out of cowardice, out of calculation. They feared not death. They feared what came after life, what came after capture, what came in the dark, where screams were muffled by shame. Because once a leader is violated, he cannot rule. Once a protector is unmanned, he cannot protect. Once a tribe is stripped of dignity, it falls apart from the inside. That was the genius of Viking terror. They didn't need to sack every village. They didn't need to rape every man. They just needed the stories to travel faster than their ships. Once the myth took root, once fear infected the wind itself, the battle was already won. A rumor, a whispered account, a firelight tale of what happened to the chief of the next village, and entire towns opened their gates, not to surrender treasure, but to preserve their humanity. The Vikings weaponized intimacy. They turned the act of domination into a tool of conquest. They understood that flesh could be geography, that identity could be burned like a flag, that one man's humiliation could be an entire people's collapse. And they perfected this art, not with pride, but with precision. Because for them, the battlefield didn't end where the sword stopped. It continued into the body, into memory, into ritualized erasure. And in that theater of war, they never truly lost. Part 4. The sex slave industry. This was not chaos, not madness. It was cold. It was calculated. It was commerce, and the most profitable kind. The trade of bodies stripped of names. The Viking slave trade was not a symptom of war. It was the war. A war that didn't end when the last sword fell, but began when the last scream was silenced. They didn't just seize gold or livestock or grain. They took flesh, living, trembling, raw, not randomly, not opportunistically, but methodically. Across the North Sea, markets in places like Dublin and York operated with grim efficiency. These were not hidden dens or underground cells. These were public, organized, sanctioned, visible proofs of power. Buyers, nobles, warriors, traders strolled past rows of chained captives. They inspected hips. They opened mouths to check teeth. They ran fingers across skin, measuring youth, symmetry, softness, and for some, especially the young, the beautiful, the delicate, their worth wasn't measured in strength or utility. It was measured in how well they might submit, how pleasing their suffering might be. This wasn't shameful. This wasn't taboo. It was law. Viking legal codes made the hierarchy of flesh explicit. To rape a freeborn woman was a crime against society, punishable by death. But to rape a slave woman? Just a fine, a debt owed, like breaking a cartwheel or damaging someone's sheep. The implication was clear. A slave had no self. She was not someone. She was something. Her body was an extension of her owner's will, no more sacred than a cup, no more protected than a pair of boots. And so every Viking raid was more than conquest. It was harvest, a harvest of wombs, of limbs, of mouths that could scream or kiss or beg. They brought these bodies back not just to labor, but to lie in the corners of longhouses, to kneel when summoned, to warm the feet of their captors, to perform obedience until it became instinct. Some were sold on to Constantinople, Baghdad, the far reaches of the Caliphate. Others were kept, displayed like living trophies, proof that their masters had conquered not only villages, but desire itself. The richest Vikings competed. Who had the most slaves? Who had the fairest, the youngest, the most broken? Owning sexual slaves wasn't immoral. It was prestigious. To have many was a mark of virility, not cruelty. And the slaves? There was no hope, only ranking. The more you submitted, smiled, pleased, endured, the better your odds of survival. You might receive warmer furs, softer bread, or fewer fists. But resistance? That was suicide. Those who refused were turned into warnings, beaten slowly, publicly, their screams not silenced but amplified, so others would listen, so others would learn. And the new ones, the girls just taken, still bleeding from the raid, they were forced to watch. Eyes held open, hands bound, lessons burned into the soul long before the first touch. Over time, resistance became rarity. Then a rumor, then a myth. The psychological conditioning was perfect. No chains stronger than fear. No prison deeper than learned obedience. This wasn't just physical captivity. It was spiritual extinction. And the children? They watched. They saw their mothers taken, their sisters sold, their own innocence priced in the eyes of men who laughed over firelight. And they learned, early, deeply, without words, that in this world a body was a currency. That pain could be bartered and pleasure could be bought. That intimacy was an invoice. And what did Viking society do? Nothing. No shame. No remorse. They recorded slave ownership in ledgers, in inheritance documents. They passed down human beings like heirlooms. Because this wasn't evil to them. It was structure, divine order, the natural hierarchy of the strong and the broken. The cost of strength was someone else's flesh. And yet, this was only half the horror. Because the marketplace was only one stage, the longhouse only one room. The worst was still to come. It came during death, during fire, during rituals soaked in silence and semen, where slaves weren't just used, they were sacrificed. But that is a story for another flame. Part 5, Ritual, Rape, and Flame. When a Viking chieftain died, the sky did not weep. The people did not wail. There was no mourning, only preparation. The longship was pulled from its moorings like a great beast being readied for sacrifice. Timber was carved with runes of farewell. Ale was brewed in barrels as deep as graves. Oxen were slaughtered, torches readied, and somewhere, hidden in the hush between footsteps and firelight, a slave girl was chosen. They called it a gift. They called it honor. They called it ritual. But it was a death sentence stitched in silk and lies. She was always young, always trembling, always told this was sacred, that to die with her master was to be reborn beside him in the next world. "Will you go with him?" they asked. It wasn't really a question. If she said yes, she was praised, touched gently on the head, given wine and warm clothes. If she said no, another would be chosen, and she would live, but as a coward, as an outcast, as the girl who wouldn't serve even in death. But saying yes didn't bring peace. It brought 7 nights of horror, 7 nights where her body ceased to be her own. 7 nights where the men of the tribe came to her, not out of lust, not out of hatred, but out of duty. Each man who climbed onto her did so with a whisper. Take my strength to him. Tell him I was faithful. Carry my courage to the next world. They weren't defiling her. They believed they were offering themselves through her to him. She became a vessel, a chalice for masculine essence, a living bridge between the land of the breathing and the halls of the honored dead. And so they poured themselves into her again and again and again. She was drugged with herbs. She was kept drunk on honey wine. She was dressed like a bride and raped like a beast. And each morning she was washed and perfumed, ready for the next set of hands. By the 7th night, she didn't scream. She didn't speak. She didn't exist. Only her skin remained, soft, empty, polished like wood, waiting to burn. And then came the day of fire. They led her, barefoot, hollow-eyed, through the village. Children watched. Elders bowed. She was not a person. She was the final sacrifice. At the water's edge, 6 men waited, each chosen to represent a pillar of the tribe: war, harvest, blood, wind, fire, bone. One by one, they took her aboard the funeral ship. One by one, they entered her, in view of all. This was not hidden. This was sacred. Then came the angel of death, an old woman, cloaked in black furs, eyes cold as the fjords. In one hand, a braided cord. In the other, a curved blade. She sat beside the girl, stroked her face, whispered words the living would never hear. And then, as the tribe chanted, drums pounding like a second heartbeat, she strangled the girl with the cord. And while the last breath fluttered from her lips, she stabbed her beneath the ribs. Clean, ritualistic, efficient. No screams, no final plea, only silence, and then smoke. The ship was set ablaze. It drifted into the sea, carrying the dead chieftain and the girl he had owned in life and offered in death into the next world. But she wasn't remembered. She wasn't even named. In the songs sung around fires, she became the girl, the chosen, the gift. No lineage, no voice, only function. And the people watched the flames and smiled, because to them, this wasn't a crime. It was completion, devotion made flesh, power made permanent. And they did it again and again and again. From the cliffs of Norway to the black rivers of Rus, the graves speak in silence. The Oseberg ship, buried with 2 women, one revered, the other ripped open. The Kaupong grave, where bones of a slave curled beside a lord. The Burka mound, where knife marks still whisper of her final hour. Different names, same truth. Death, for the Vikings, was never just death. It was performance. It was ownership, staged as eternity. And the division didn't end with the fire. Even after death, Viking women were torn in 2. The free ones were remembered, etched into sagas as queens, seers, shield maidens. The enslaved ones? They were ritual instruments, used, burned, forgotten. And the most chilling part? No one objected. Not the men, not the gods, not the laws, not even the women. Because by then even resistance had become ritualized silence. Part 6. Legacy of Terror. The ships are long gone. The chants have faded. The swords rust beneath the earth. But the damage, the ideology, the infection still lingers. The Vikings didn't just leave ruins behind. They left a blueprint, a model for domination. A system of control so precise, so effective, that entire civilizations studied it, then replicated it. Because what they built wasn't just a culture. It was a weaponized philosophy, a worldview where sex, just power, shame, silence, violence, virtue. They proved you didn't need armies to conquer a people. You just had to shatter their sense of self, turn their bodies against them, make them believe that submission wasn't just defeat, but destiny. And the rest of Europe watched as Viking raids carved their way through monasteries and villages. Their enemies learned to survive by copying what they feared. Slavery spread. Sexual control became statecraft. Religious rape rituals morphed into sacred traditions in other courts and cultures. And over time, the names changed. But the system remained. Inquisitions, crusades, colonial punishments, gendered violence justified by honor, by gods, by order. It all echoes back to those burning ships, those violated bodies, those laws written in sweat, blood, and semen. Even today, the fingerprints remain. Legal systems that value consent differently based on class or status. Cultures where masculinity is measured by conquest, not character. Societies that still shame victims before punishing abusers. The Vikings did not invent brutality, but they refined it. They ritualized it. They made it look holy. And once something is made sacred, it becomes dangerous to question. That is the most terrifying legacy of all. Because when cruelty hides behind tradition, when oppression wears the mask of religion, when domination is taught as destiny, it doesn't die, it adapts. So the next time someone says the Vikings were just brave warriors, remember the slave girl who burned. Remember the kings who wept in silence. Remember the children who learned that a body wasn't a temple, but a cage. This isn't just about the past. It's about what we inherited. The question isn't whether the Vikings were monsters. The question is, how much of their darkness still lives in us? Let history be a mirror, not a mask.